Hey, what is up, and welcome to Thursday's episode of Where All the Ladies At. My name is Kim. I am your host, and this is a podcast where we dive deep into history, myth, and legend and try to figure out where the fuck all the women went and shine a light on those women who did some pretty exceptionally badass things that just don't seem to get enough credit. So, that's something you're into, you definitely found the right place. Like I said, I am Kim. I'm your host. I am a history nerd. I am a archaeology groupie and a novelist, writer. I do fiction and nonfiction as well. And I have always loved history. I think I got it from my mom. It's one of the things that I'm definitely sure we both shared. And she always used to have like these, for those in the US, you'll know the ones I'm talking about, the Time Life series. And we would always get those. And so I read a lot of stuff about ancient civilizations. So I do think I owe my love of history to my mom. So yeah, and that's a little bit about me. This month we are focusing on a couple of different things. This Monday was my last in a series about Illyrian goddesses. So if you haven't seen that, go check that out. And as for the history portion, we are talking about warrior queens. I have covered some really cool queens, Tuta, Tamar, and today is Kubaba, and she is a queen that became a goddess, so that's pretty dope. And that's who we're covering today. But before we get to that, as usual, if you've been here before, you know I always do some housekeeping and shameless plugging, and that's what I'm going to do now. If you want to reach out to me, you can do that through my social media. I also have an email down there for those that like to rock it old school. I would love to hear from you guys, have suggestions, or just want to comment and talk about some people and everything. I would love it. I would love to build a community that really is here to support women, and that's kind of what I'm all about. If you would like to support the podcast, I would really appreciate you guys to like, comment, share, reach out to me, send me messages, all those kind of things. Any type of engagement with the podcast or the video on YouTube will get me pushed out in the algorithm more. I can only do so much SEO. Sometimes it has to come from engagement. So I'd really appreciate that. If you have some cash and you want to kick it my way, you can do that too. You can do that through my Buy Me a Coffee or my Patreon, which will become more active in May. I know I've said that before, but I'm serious this time. I'm starting to get my schedule down pat. If you would like to know about this historical figure and so much more, I would go check out my Medium publication. I am by trade a writer, so there is a lot of stuff over there as well. And that too is going to pick up as well. And if you would like to check out my other podcast called Our Mystic Road Trip, it's about spiritual wellness, magic, mystical kind of stuff, holistic healing and all that. And if that's something you're into, head over there and check that out as well. I'd love to see you here and there. It'd be interesting if the communities kind of merge together. Who knows? Maybe someday. That is it for the shameless plugging and housekeeping. Now we can get into the actual topic of the day, which is Kubaba, the Mesopotamian unexpected queen. Alright guys, so as usual, you guys know, if you've been here before, that I like to go into what was happening in the region that this woman was growing up in during her lifetime, and also what it was like for women in that culture. And the reason I do that for those that are new here is because I really feel like you can understand the person a lot more if you understand their environment and the challenges that they had. And so I think it's important to understand the context, and that's really, really big for me. So in this case, because we're talking about Kubaba, we're stepping in way back into the ancient world, 2500 BCE. This was a time of big change. development, especially in the region that we're talking about, which is Mesopotamia. It would be the third dynasty of the Kish. And Mesopotamia is kind of the area where Iraq is now. And there was a lot of powers at play in this area, right? City states, and each one was kind of vying for its own control, its own wealth, its influence. And the one at the heart of this is the Kish. That's why when I said Mesopotamia, I said the third dynasty of Kish, because Kish is the city state that was like kind of in the center of this all, right? Kish was positioned kind of in a pretty key location, right? It was between the powerhouse of the Sumerians, right, in the south, and the Akkadian Empire in the north. And this made it kind of this like very essential crossroads for trade and culture and military strategy. The city of Kish, the area, was pretty much a bustling center, right? Its streets were alive. There were sounds of merchants and people were selling goods, and religious rituals were taking place, all of these things, right? Scribes were tapping away on those clay tablets. Kudos to them for doing that, trying to document everything. It was a time when the foundations of civilization were kind of being laid down, right? The Sumerians were inventing writing with cuneiform, and this was a system of writing that would allow to keep track of everything from trade to transactions to royal decrees, all this, right? They were building the wheel, they were designing complex irrigation systems, developing some of the earliest forms of laws. But despite all these advancements, it was still a pretty male-dominated society, right? The rulers were kings, military commanders, priests. The city-state's leadership was entrenched in patriarchy. The king's role was central, not just to the political leadership, but also religious and military as well. The kings were seen as divinely chosen, having a direct connection to the gods, and that gave them a lot of power. But this was a time of upheaval too. Powerful kings were, they were there, but the dynamics between city-states were constantly shifting, right? In one generation, a city-state would rise to dominance. The next, it would fall to its neighbors and be swallowed up by larger empires. It was a very volatile environment, and this created opportunities for those who could take charge. And for some, against all odds, there was breaks in traditional patterns of powers. Sometimes that's what happened, right? This is where Kubaba comes in. She was from Kish. And we will go into a lot more of her in a little bit, but this is where she kind of shone. Now, speaking of women, looking at women in ancient Mesopotamia, you could find them in wide range roles, right? But their status was tied to their family's position and wealth, right? For women of the elite classes, those that were married to kings and wealthy merchants and all, there was kind of this level of power, but it was always often veiled, right? So it's kind of like the woman that controls the man, right? Elite women had a lot of influence over household affairs, and some even like managed estates. Many women, particularly in the Sumerian area, were the backbone of economic activity because they managed the resources and properties. But even despite those roles, women's power was tied to the men in their lives, right? Fathers, husbands, brothers were that. For those women, for women, just in general, the importance in society was measured more by the relationship to powerful men than by their own abilities. It was kind of common for women to really have influence, like I said, pull the strings behind the scenes, right? But oftentimes their contributions were unrecorded and eclipsed by the men in charge, and sometimes that means them taking credit. Kubaba is a very rare case, and so that's where we will find things, right? So if we're looking at, Kubaba's was kind of, how do I say it? So Kubaba, she wasn't just bigger, she was a ruler, right? But there was a lot of things that had to be put in place before she could get there, right? So let's talk a little bit about women of the lower classes. Their lives were a lot more difficult, right? They were expected to fulfill the traditional roles as we've heard before, having the babies, cleaning the house, cooking the food. That's kind of what they were there for, right? Working in the fields or in their husband's business as well. They had women that didn't have a lot of money or social standing tended to have less rights, right? They had little freedom. The legal system at the time was very skewed. It allowed some women some rights, and but it was still skewed for men, right? Women could own property, but it had to be through the male heads of their families, and the access to the property or business was a direct result of that family's wealth. So divorce, when it comes to like relationships in general, divorce was possible, but it was very rare. Because in patriarchal societies, a woman divorcing a man would be seen as kind of crazy and a little bit of an anomaly. And there would be a huge stigma attached to it if it did happen, right? Women's autonomy was very limited, and their roles were largely defined by their relationships to men. As I said before, and some women, of course, defied the odds, like Kubaba, but it was very rare and far between. So now you have a little bit of idea about what Kubaba was up against when it came down to it. So let's look at her story and how she overcame that, right? This woman started out in a very humble role, right? She found herself, and still yet she found herself ruling Kish, right? You have to understand the backdrop of when she ascended, right? And that's why we talked about that before. Kubaba wasn't born into a royal family. She didn't have a golden birthright. There was no noble lineage. She started as a simple tavern keeper, a business owner in a society where women, even more privileged, even in more privileged social circles, really typically didn't have that autonomy, right? She ran a tavern, and this would have not only required business acumen, but also a certain level of independence. She interacted with all kinds of walks of life, from wealthy merchants to common laborers, and that kind of made her this economic player, but also like a social connector. And that type of independence, especially for women, was pretty unheard of in these places, right? Women, lower middle class, could own businesses, but their influence was really limited. And so what's really extraordinary about Kubaba is that she ran a tavern, but she turned that position to something much more powerful. And how did she do it? How did she move to becoming a queen and even to a goddess? That's kind of hard to tell, because here's the thing. We're talking about 2500 BCE, right? That's a long time ago, right? And so obviously there wasn't a lot of, there was transcripts and there were things, but a lot of the story about how she came into power is really kind of almost like mythical, right? Some accounts say that her rise was the result of a sudden heroic event. She was able to lead people through a time of crisis, and she stepped in to fill a power or one that says she stepped in to fill a power vacuum. The Sumerian king list, which is a very famous record of all the Mesopotamian rulers, gives her credit for reigning for over a century. So 100 years of power. That's a pretty long time. And it's even more so when you realize it was a woman that was doing that. So how Kubaba rose to power kind of remains unclear. One thing is certain, and she was not just a figurehead. She was real. She was an active ruler. She had to navigate a lot of political complexity. The landscape of Kish was really hard. She had to manage a military, and she had to deal with external threats. And this was all while trying to maintain a position in a city-state that had its own established patriarchal systems, right? It's one thing for a woman to hold a title. It's another to actually wield the power. And Kubaba did that very well. She wasn't a monarch. She didn't just sit on a throne, right? She wasn't a monarch in name only. She was leading her people through challenges, and she was most likely, from everything that they could find, involved in military action, alliances, diplomacy. But there's something so fascinating about the nature of her reign, right? She didn't just break the glass ceiling at that time, right? She, she was a woman in a world that belonged to male rulers, and yet she still stepped into the role with everything, right? So here's the thing, how did she impact the region? Because once again, the story of her is very challenging to piece together. She's on the list. She's said to have ruled 100 years, which I guess she could rule 100 years. It's highly unlikely at the time, but and there's stories of her, but it's not. It's all kind of just pushed together, right? The thing is that the fact that a woman, like many of the other women that we've talked about, could rule in Mesopotamia, it's pretty revolutionary, right? She helmed the city-state of Kish, and there was a lot of challenges going on, right? This was one of the most dynamic and competitive periods in Mesopotamian history, right? Kish was a significant player, like we talked about, and by the time the Kubaba came to power, the balance of power was shifting. Akkad, for instance, was growing in strength under rulers like Sargon, and the Sumerian states were in constant competition with one another for resources, influence, control. Kish had a strategic location, and so there was a lot of tension, and they had to have a strong ruler, and Kubaba was very capable. She helmed and provided a lot of stability and a sense of pride as well. What makes Kubaba's reign kind of remarkable is the context in which she ruled. She ascended during a time when city-states like Akkad were kind of emerging. She didn't oversee peace and stability, right? It wasn't a time period where she was like, oh, it's all cushy and relaxed, cushy and Kish. No, it wasn't that. It was a hectic time period. And she was resilient, and she really was able to face the pressure, her reign could potentially have been very key to Kish's survival and its strength during the time, right? She was a monarch who focused on maintaining the status. She didn't. There was no status quo. She embodied the idea of leadership and resilience and flexibility and ability, and perhaps maybe more important than all, she really defied traditional gender norms, right? The king was central. We've talked about that. And so she challenged the structure. She changed it. Kubaba made a pretty big mark, to here's the thing. It was a patriarchal society. So on that list of Mesopotamian kings, they could have very well just left her off, right? Because a woman amidst this doesn't seem like doesn't seem right. But they still chose to put her name in the power, right? And so this showed that Kubaba left her mark. Like I said, there was a legacy, and she had a long reign, and after she died, which of course we don't really know when she died, she lived on, right? She was the Akkadian people, who were one of the most influential cultures in the ancient world, remembered her not just as a monarch, but as a goddess. So that's where she transformed, right? The Akkadian people, who weren't even the people she ruled over, saw her as this like queen, but also elevated her to goddess. They worshipped her. It's that, that in and of itself, that this other empire saw her and then chose to, elevate her to that status. It's a recognition. It's just a recognition of her extraordinary role in history. She was a tavern owner who worked her way to be a queen and then wound up being a goddess. Like, what? Like, that's just, her rule meant for the world that leadership wasn't confined. It showed power and influence and resilience, like I said. And in a world where men like Sargon and later Hammurabi would rise to power, Kubaba's reign still stood as a testament to her leadership. Her reign was not just a local anomaly. It was a precedent for the future. And many people would look back and hear stories about her and maybe be inspired a little bit, The legacy of her after her reign is simply this, right? And as I said, the biggest thing that I could point to that shows how effective she was is that in Akkadian text, she was elevated to a goddess. Her deification is remarkable. That doesn't happen. It was a culture that was dominated by male rulers, and even the gods in their mythology, the men gods played a more divine part, right, in a lot of places. But Kubaba, in the eyes of the people, came to represent not just leadership, but like protection, prosperity, strength. This was what she stood for, and she embodied that with every bit of thing that she did. From everything we could tell, once again, let me repeat, like, we can only go off of the things we know, and this is conjecture on some places, but everything that everybody has pieced together, this is how it happened. It's amazing. I think that the people of Kish saw her as more than just a ruler as well. She was a protector, she was a beacon of hope, and of course, eventually, like, her divinity would become kind of a tool for political and cultural cohesion, and this helped the people of Kish really understand that leadership comes from all kinds of different places. In later periods, other cultures like the Akkadians and Babylonians would continue to reference her and reinforce her impact on the region. She stepped outside of Kish's borders in that aspect, and maybe that's one of the more significant pieces, is that she did rule this very pivotal place, but also the people that would have been, I'll use air quotes, her enemies, also like were infatuated with her too. Kind of awesome, And that's Kubaba, guys. Tavern keeper to queen to goddess. What a ride. I can't even imagine, her legacy and her story, even though not really well defined, is kind of remarkable. And who knows if we'll ever really get to know more about her. But what we do know is that she was a badass lady, and clearly shattered some expectations. And that's it for this week, guys. Like, I hope you enjoyed learning about Kubaba. I hope you enjoyed learning about all of the warrior queens we talked about this month. I'm so excited. Next month we are celebrating Asian and Pacific Islander Heritage Month. And yes, we are going to, because I don't care what anybody says. Everybody needs to be included. Everybody. Diversity, equity, inclusion. And that is what I stand for. I hope you guys enjoy. And you know what? We're going to really shine some light on some pretty cool ladies from the Asian and Pacific Islander world. I did focus a little bit more on the Asian aspect this time, but we'll see what goes. Maybe something will pop in there. Who knows? Yeah. And the goddesses are cool. The ladies, there's some cool ladies. Some cool ladies. I can't wait to tell you guys about them. So yeah. I hope you guys enjoyed learning about Kubaba. Check her out. Remember that your local archaeologist is a superhero. And until next time, guys, stay safe, stay curious, and stay blessed.